I feel like the word perfect gets used a lot in music, especially when it comes to talking about albums. Oh, this is a perfect album, perfect listen.
10 on 10,
Yeah,
classic,
that whole
all that stuff.
conversation, absolutely. And it always gets a bit shady, right? Because, like, what does constitute a perfect album, right? Because I have very few track lists that I consider to be perfect, but they're all completely different albums regardless. Like, you could look at production and say that's flawless, but maybe the writing isn't flawless, and then that knocks off points. So, like, what constitutes a perfect album to you, Louis?
Man, it's super tough. And by the way, guys, let us know down in the comments what makes a perfect album to you. But for me, I mean, it's an obvious answer, but, you know, it has to be flawless, right? No shit. It needs to be good in every single component. So that's kind of what I'm looking for when I'm going into, you know, choosing an album to be perfect. I have to enjoy every single transition, every ad-lib, every fucking moan on the album. Literally everything to the last detail, I have to get some enjoyability out of it. But I think that, you know, it's interesting for us to talk about this just because when we rate albums, we use a system that goes from bad, mid, good, great, amazing, and then finally perfect. But since we've been reviewing new albums on the channel, we're still yet to give that perfect rating. And we did give a few. We did one on Patreon for our Kid See Ghost review. We gave that perfect. Our Good Kid, Mad City classic review that we have on the channel, we also gave that a perfect. But in terms of new drops, we're still yet to give it. So I kind of want to ask you that. Like, why do you think we've been so harsh on albums maybe? Like, why do you think there hasn't been a perfect album from us?
It's just so hard to give, right? Like, when was the last time you really saw that perfect album? By the way, that video is available up on the channel as well. Like, I believe, like, I had Daytona into that conversation, right? And going through a track list that truly feels flawless feels like almost like Mission Impossible in 2022. And I kind of want to backtrack from that too, because like I felt like maybe I should have given something like Sometimes I Might Be Introvert a perfect rating. Like, now going back, if I had to go back and do that review, I can make a bunch of arguments for why I think that album is perfect.
And that's a really good point, just because I feel like when it comes to deciding what a perfect or a 10 on 10 album is, it's super hard to do that when you're reviewing an album, let's say a day later, a week later, a month later. Like, most albums that I consider perfect, stuff like Ready to Die by Biggie or The Chronic by Dr. Dre, I've had years and years to actually digest them and to know for a fact that I've listened to these so many times and that I can't actually pick out a single flaw. So I feel like when we are reviewing these newer albums, it's hard for it to click right away and for all the pieces to kind of fall together. So that's really interesting. Another thing I want to talk about too is that I feel like the word perfect and classic are kind of, you know, said synonymously together. Like, people don't really distinguish the two, and I feel like there is a difference there, right? Like a classic album, something like The College Dropout by Kanye West or something like Get Rich or Die Trying by 50 Cent, you can't debate against those albums being classic. Like, their impact has been seen, it's been documented, there's no fucking use arguing against that. But when it comes to a perfect album, it's totally subjective, right? Like, there's no real answer to what a perfect album is, and that's what makes it so interesting. But before I ask you what makes a perfect album for you, I just want to say that, like, you know, for us, and the reason why I think we haven't given a perfect rating yet is that our reviews would carry no fucking weight if we said, you know, Future, you get a perfect rating. Kid Cudi, you get a perfect rating. Like, if we just, you know, turn into the Oprah show, it would be no fucking fun.
Yeah, it wouldn't be super fun. And the thing is, too, is that, like, it's really hard to give a perfect rating in my eyes just because I have different criteria. So let's actually get into this, right? So I was thinking about this over the weekend because, like, I was thinking about it, you know, maybe am I too harsh, right? Am I waiting for that special moment to give my first perfect rating? And I don't think I have been, because the criteria that we follow kind of, you know, follow perfect suit to what goes into an album. So example, artist performance, right? Like, the artist carrying out the vision of this track list. How did he or she perform on this? You know, was everything on par? Whether if it's more like melodic singing driven, whether it's more rap driven, like, how was that executed? Then you get into the content matter. Like, is the substance within that track list, you know, meaningful? Like, do you want to go through it and, like, are you engaged? Is there a storyline? And if there is that well executed? Example, production. Like, it's hard for me to give an album, you know, a perfect rating on production if it's not to the same standards as like something like 2001 for me. Let's say the features, you know, you could have.
Okay, wait, you said something interesting there. We said if it's not to the standards of 2001. So, like, do you do this in a sense? And I feel like a lot of us obviously always compare when we're actually reading albums. But, like, do you look at an album like, I don't know, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and say, oh, you know what? It doesn't match the production of 2001. So for that reason, it's not a perfect album. Like, is it always a compare and contrast?
No, it's not. It's more of like when you know situation, right? Like, obviously you're not going to get a flawlessly engineered and well-crafted masterpiece of a production and soundscape like 2001, but I gave that a perfect rating for production. So if I have to put it into the same class in the same sort of atmosphere,
bro,
it has to at least to be able to play on there.
That
you know
was
what I'm trying to
such
say?
like a different pivotal time in hip hop. I mean, Dr. Dre and his team literally redid all the samples that they were using from that album and played them with live instruments. Like, not every artist is gonna kind of do that.
I agree
like,
with you, but like even for me, like let's say Kids See Ghost.
Okay.
You know, 7 tracks. I gave that production perfect. It's a completely different soundscape and era for hip hop, but I consider that to be perfect. There was not a single flaw within the engineering. The sequencing with the album was perfect. Even looking at the sample choices and like all the beautiful synth lines and bass lines within there, like that's a perfectly produced album. Even something like To Pimp a Butterfly. Maybe it's not on the level of production for me as 2001, but all of the influences of jazz and neo soul and all of the sequencing and all the meshing together, that sounded perfect to me. So like I'm not looking at soundscapes and trying to, you know, compare. It's just that like, okay, I think that's on a similar level, so I could put it into the same class. But I want to talk about features too, because features are hard. Not everyone's gonna have a My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy or Astral, you know, feature list.
But
and
we know
that's
that.
tough.
Like, how many track lists do we know and love that have 0 features at the end of the day? You know what I mean?
But like that's why it's kind of hard to like say that too. It's because like you just got to see how they play into the track list.
Yeah.
And I feel like the easiest sort of, you know, thing to give a perfect rating is on the replay value, instant replay value, because you know how much this is going to give into your rotation. Like if I know this is a lock in my rotation for the next couple of years, example, I'll be able to say yes. And if there's no skips on there, I'll say it's
that's
perfect
hard
replay
to judge
value.
though. Like when I first heard Kids See Ghost, for example, I wasn't really vibing with it that much, and now it's one of my most replayed Kanye albums of all time. So even that one's hard to judge. But I want to ask you this: like, I feel like when I'm reviewing albums, I try to be, you know, a harsh critic. I try to kind of, you know, hold these artists that we know and love to the highest pedestal because we know how talented they are for the most part, right?
Absolutely.
So I feel like I do tend to be harsh. But let me ask you this: like, how harsh does a criticism go for you? Like, let's say you find 2 to 3 lyrics, 2 to 3 bars on an album that are super whack. They're totally, you know, out of left field.
Can't be
for
perfect.
2 lines.
Can't be perfect.
Wow.
If it's
Okay.
super whack lyrics, like I mean, that does diminish the like. Then how could you call the writing or content matter perfect to that standard? Right?
I know.
You technically can't. Then it would go.
What
okay,
if
it's
you
amazing.
love every single song on that album? Every single beat is fucking like Beethoven level of orchestration, bro. You know what I
It
mean?
still
Like,
doesn't matter. Then it can't be considered perfect.
Okay,
Like, Go
okay.
through Daytona's writing. Try to find me a single line in there that's whack. Same thing for Tip
she'll
of a
turn
Butterfly.
around, fuck you, and then fuck the janitor.
I still fucked with that
it
punchline.
wasn't that whack. It wasn't whack enough.
You know
what
not-
I mean?
It's
Yeah.
a very passable line. Like it's good. Like it got me intrigued into that song. Like I
What
can't.
was that exact line again? It was never find love in a bitch that loves the camera. No.
Anyway,
How did that go, bro?
I don't even want to know.
Sheesh.
Whatever. We'll continue going with this. But I mean, like, you know, looking at perfect albums, right? That's kind of hard because, like, you could be that harsh critic. So, like, what are you looking for exactly out of it? Like, do you go track by track? Do you go overall vision? Because even when I'm looking at a perfect album, I'm not the track by track guy just because, like, you're not always going to find, you know, the level of quality from each track to each track, or maybe I don't understand it off the bat. But for me, it's just more of like, was this vision executed on a perfect scale? That's more of like what I look for, because like I could understand the concept behind an album, right? You go into an album, you look at the writing, you look at the themes, look at the production styles, you understand what they were trying to execute, and then you see how that execution was performed. So like, how do you like to go into these things? Is it track by track? Like, how do you like
The
run
first
this?
major thing for me is that the album has to have no skips. From beginning to end, there needs to be consistency within that track list. And if there's even a single skip, it's not going to be a perfect album at the end of the day. The other thing, too, is that I feel like a lot of people out there are lying right now, bro, because so many people I see nowadays with newer albums that come out, there's like fucking 20-song track lists, and they try to convince themselves that there isn't a single skip. Like, yes, obviously, there are albums like the Marshall Mathers LP by Eminem that have like that 20-song runtime that don't have any skips, but in today's era, that is so fucking rare to have a lengthy track list with no skips.
It is.
So I feel like that's super important. Another thing for me is cohesiveness. Like, I want every track on that album to have a relationship to the next track in terms of having a consistent mood, a consistent thematic scope, a consistent sound.
Yes, sir.
I need that, you know, to kind of fuel the purpose of the album and for that to really take center stage. Like, there has to be a main idea. For example, like, obviously, I know you and I both love concept albums, but I don't need a concept to make an album perfect. For
That's
example,
facts.
something like Without Warning. I love that album so much, and that's an album that I deem to be perfect just because of how consistent that dark and haunting mood is all throughout. And also, just 21 Savage and Offset's commitment to playing those anti-heroes who have these kind of murderous, I would say, personalities.
Even like the chemistry between them was super well executed.
Yeah.
Because like you could get into those collaboration albums and you could kind of say like, oh wow, like they're not connecting on a good level, and it kind of ruins the whole vibe of the album. So example, like, going back to 36 Chambers, I consider that to be a perfect album. Why? Because, how do you have that many rappers on the same album and everything sounds so concise and so well driven together? And like that's why I think these track lists have to be perfect. Another thing for me, the earworm. The earworm is big for me, bro. Like if I'm not playing this in my rotation all that much, like it's kind of hard for me to deem it classic, because like yes, quality does translate into replay value for me to a certain extent. And I'm not saying it's for everything, right? Like, there's obviously exceptions in there. Like, I can maybe consider a few track lists perfect that I don't revisit all that much, but like, it has to be kind of like fucking ear porn to a certain extent, bro. Like, you want to be playing this in your headphones. So whether that's, the types of like engineering practices that are being taken on there, like, I don't want to hear a bunch of fucking beats that sound like they're from YouTube, and then I listen to these artists' vocals and they're like standing like this away from their mic, and then you're trying to listen to that in your headphones, and it ruins the listening experience. Because at the end of the day, like, you could critique all you want, but if it doesn't have like that crisp sound to it and it doesn't sound like a well-crafted piece of art, you can't go into this and actually enjoy that. Plus, one big thing for me too, live instrumentation. Okay, like that's one thing that I'm a sucker for, especially within my production choices. So
that's so rare in hip-hop, though, you know what I mean?
But that's why I find it so fucking cool. And like there was the whole thing about DJ Khaled and the FL Studios, like, oh, that's garbage, because use FL Studio. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you go through, let's say, something like 2001 or To Pimp a Butterfly, all of that live instrumentation, regardless of the style that's being used, you hear it within the quality of the recordings. You know what you're listening to. It's a different type of listening experience. So that's another thing I take
What
into
I want to ask you
consideration.
now, though, is that like when it comes to you really deciding is this a perfect album, do you kind of look at it from a subjective standpoint in the sense of like, you know what, I get maximum enjoyability out of this album, and that's a big reason why I find it to be perfect? Or are you looking at it more from like the objective point, in the case of something like, I don't know, The Money Store by Death Grips, where it's like so many critics have thought of it to be perfect, groundbreaking, influential for the industrial hip hop scene, so on and so forth? Like, do you try to blend both of that? Are you also looking at like, one big thing for me is like the actual technical aspects of something like the singing on an album, the progression of the instrumentals, the mixing and mastering? Like, do you encompass all of that, or is it more like enjoyability is king?
Well, it's everything. I feel like for me to say enjoyability is king is
it kind of has to be, though, for you to call it to be perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, like, you're not going to call something perfect if you don't have that enjoyability factor. So I like what you said about the technical components. Like, if I'm not enjoying, like, let's say the mixing or mastering or the vocals or singing on an album, how could it be considered perfect for me, and how could I really enjoy it like that? So as you were asking me, am I more objective or subjective, like while I'm going into these reviews and doing it? For me, it's a mix of both. Like, I don't try to be too robotic, because I feel like it kind of kills the vibe of the music, and then as a listener, you can't really connect your soul to the music. And like, I'm a soulful dude, I like to actually connect to the music and feel it on a different level. So I need that aspect to it, and then maybe I need more of like the nerdy stuff for me to be like, okay, let me go into the writing on Genius and let me see how everything's put together. Let me go into these production styles and let me see how everything's layered and how it's hitting in my mixing headphones. So I try to do a bit of both. How about you?
I totally agree with that. I mean, obviously the technical aspects are super integral, and I feel like if those technical aspects are good and are quality, then it obviously leads to enjoyability. But at the end of the day, like, I don't care who tells me this album is a 10 on 10, this album is perfect, this album was groundbreaking. Like, at the end of the day, if I'm not personally vibing with an album, no matter how good it might be technically, I'm not going to bullshit anyone. You know what I mean? I'm not going to bullshit myself first and foremost. I'm not going to consider that a perfect album, no matter how great it might be seen by everyone. But guys, this question is now for you. What do you think makes a perfect album? Let us know down in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. And if this is your first time watching, stay tuned, because we're going to be doing more content on perfect albums and actually putting together some lists of albums that we think are perfect. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.